Could you tell us about a couple different forms of skepticism and what might motivate a skeptic to affirm them?
Yeah, I mean, the most popular form of skepticism is external world skepticism. This is the view that we cannot know any contingent propositions about the external world. Okay, so by the external world, I mean everything outside of your own mind, right? And by contingent propositions, I mean things that could be more than one way, could have been otherwise. All right, so these external world skeptics would say, you don't know whether I exist. I don't know whether you exist. Right? You don't know anything about the physical world. Don't even know if you have a hand, because that's external to my mind. Um, and But they would not deny that you know that 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, so because that's an example of a necessary truth instead of a contingent truth. And then some skeptics are more extreme. So what we call global skepticism is the view that you can't know any propositions whatsoever. Right. So, not even skepticism itself. Okay. So according to the global skeptics, you don't even know if you exist. All right. And so, why would anybody think these things? I guess like the most common argument for global skepticism is the regress argument. This is where people say, well, in order to know anything, you have to have a reason for believing it. But and then the reason has to also be something that you know. So then there has to be a reason for the reason, and then that just goes on forever, right? And so, okay, you can't complete the regress, so you can never justify anything. And then, probably the most famous argument for external world skepticism is something like the brain in the vat, right? Where they just come up with scenarios for how everything could seem the way that it currently does, but your beliefs about the external world could be radically mistaken, right? So the brain in the vat scenario is scientists have they put this brain in a vat and they have little wires attached to it so they can feed it electrical stimulation, and they can stimulate the brain in exactly the pattern that a normal brain would be stimulated while interacting with the real world. Right. And so, they could create this kind of virtual reality simulation, right? And, maybe they would create a simulation of listening to a podcast where somebody's talking about a brain in a vat. So how do you know that you're not a brain in a vat?
And if you say, "Well, I just know I can see the podcast right here, and I can see my own hand," but on the brain in a vat hypothesis, that's all expected because they would be creating a very realistic simulation, right?
Yeah, yeah. You're supposed to imagine, they've got this amazing, amazing computer program to simulate everything that you would experience in normal life. So anything that you do to try to refute the brain in a vat scenario, like any evidence that you try to collect, the skeptic will say, well, that could be just part of the simulation. That they were just trying to make you think that you're not a brain in a vat. So they programmed in an experience of you reading about how brains in vats are not really feasible. And,
Right.
yeah, you try to look up the brain science, and but it turns out that they just put that into the simulation, and actually, brain science is much more advanced in the real world and whatever.
Now, there have been a lot of other responses to skepticism, such as contextualism and semantic externalism, and they deal with the use of the word know, like to know, Know, in different contexts. And while
Yeah.
you say there's some value in these attempts, you emphasize a different argument focusing on unfalsifiability. So, could you maybe
Yeah.
explain unfalsifiability and how it's shows that the brain in the vat hypothesis is a worse hypothesis than the idea that we're just in the real world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so, like what I was just saying about why you can't refute the brain in that scenario is also something that's wrong with it, right? That is the fact that any evidence that you come up with, the skeptic can just, say that they can explain that in exactly the same way, right? Whatever evidence you see, they could say, well, that was just programmed into the simulation. Okay. So that makes it unfalsifiable. And in philosophy of science, it's standardly taken that unfalsifiable theories are bad, right? Okay, now not everybody understands why unfalsifiable theories are bad. And, on the face of it, you might think, oh, well, so what? So it can't be proven false, but, so what? That doesn't, that certainly doesn't mean that it's false, right? Um, okay, and, what's really wrong with unfalsifiable theories is that they're also unsupportable, right? And this comes out of a theorem of probability, right? So basically, it's a theorem of probability that if E lowers the probability of H, then not E raises the probability of H, and vice versa. So if something counts as evidence against a theory, then the opposite counts as evidence for the theory, just in terms of raising and lowering probability. Okay, so a theory for which you cannot have evidence against it is also a theory for which you cannot have evidence for it. And that means that you do not have any evidence for it. Okay, now, so that doesn't show that it's false, but alternative theories that are falsifiable can have evidence for them, right? And so my claim is, if you have competing theories like the brain in the vat scenario versus the real world scenario, right, which is, the scenario that you're perceiving the real world normally. The real world scenario is not unfalsifiable. And so it is testable, and it therefore can have evidence in its favor. And the brain in the vat scenario cannot have evidence in its favor. Okay,
Hmm.
now, right. So now, why do I say the real world scenario is falsifiable? Well, the real world scenario implies that you should have experiences that are roughly coherent. That is, they make sense and they fit together. They can be interpreted as perceptions of real objects satisfying the laws of nature, or something like that. Okay, and that's not true of all possible experiences. And as a matter of fact, I claim that's true of only a minuscule fraction, right? Close to 0% of experiences are coherent. Meaning, if you just like had a random sequence of possible sensory experiences, it wouldn't look like anything. It wouldn't be interpretable as representing any real objects. Okay, now, so if there are scientists who are stimulating a brain, um, they could stimulate it to have any possible sequence of experiences. Okay, so just from that, so they could stimulate it to have coherent experiences, but they could also stimulate it to have incoherent experiences. So, okay. But if you're perceiving the real world, then it has to be coherent experiences. So there's a determinate prediction, which is in fact satisfied by your actual experiences, right? Okay, and so, your actual experiences count as evidence in favor of the real world scenario, right? And I claim they count as extremely strong evidence, actually, because the prediction is an extremely specific prediction.
Hmm.
Right. It doesn't sound that specific when I just say you should have coherent experiences, but out of the range of all possible experiences, the set of coherent experiences is a minuscule fraction. So it's a highly specific prediction which comes true. So the theory is strongly supported.
Hmm. So the fact that we have a generally coherent sequence of experiences is strongly predicted by the real world hypothesis, because on that hypothesis we're just interacting with with reality as it is. While on the brain in a vat hypothesis, the scientists could, as it were, like experiment with the setting. So they could randomly change the color of grass or adjust any of the psychophysical laws so that if two things collide, you have a random visual experience or things like that. And so if it was an experiment or a simulation or a brain in a vat hypothesis, then you wouldn't expect a generally coherent sequence of experiences. That's what you're arguing, right?
Yes, right. Yeah, and I mean, you imagine different things that the scientists could have done. Like most of the things that you imagine are alternative coherent experiences, but they could have just programmed completely incoherent experiences.
That's
I mean,
true.
they could have the computer just stimulating your brain completely randomly. So you just have like, random random colors in your visual field with random sounds, right? And by the way, random sounds sound like static, right? And random colors um, look like what we used to call static on a television screen, but nobody sees television screens anymore. So, but if you tuned a television to a frequency where there was nothing being broadcast, you would see a pattern that looked like random black and white. Okay, but it could be random different colors, and it just doesn't look like anything. Right. And if you're doing that, you could be producing random images for a million years and never see one that looks like anything. Right. They would just all look like static.
Now, a skeptic could, in principle, posit that the scientists who are stimulating the brain in a vat actually designed the stimulation or the experiment such that we do have coherent experiences. And so they're not constantly toying with the settings of the experiment, I guess. But I assume you'd respond to that by saying that's just an auxiliary hypothesis that adds complexity to the essential argument. Or how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of ad hoc, right? Like, okay, so that is the fundamental explanation of the source of your experiences is um, your brain event and something is directly stimulating parts of your brain. Okay, and then they have to add in stipulations about the scientists and their motives and their capabilities in order to explain your sequence of experiences. Okay, but also like, well, there are many possible sets of motivations and capabilities of the set of scientists that would have led to different experiences. All right, so like even if you assume that the scientists wanted to create a simulation of real life, the overwhelming majority of simulations do not look exactly like the real thing, right? So, like, if you try to program a computer simulation, like when you play games, they don't, in fact, look exactly like real life, right? And, periodically there are glitches in the program, right? And so on. So, like, the overwhelming majority of the space of possibilities would have things not look exactly like they currently do. Right. And then, you think about what their motivations could be. Well, you basically have to you have to stipulate some bizarre motivation. Like they want to make it look just like you live a perfectly ordinary life in the early 21st century for no particular reason. Right. So, right. So, because like if you have any other motivation, then it predicts that you would have experiences that would satisfy that, right? Like if the scientists were trying to, maybe they were trying to give you a happy life. Well, then your life should be a lot happier than it is, right? Well, maybe they were trying to study whatever human psychology. So then you should have like the most psychologically interesting life, right? Which is, I assume, isn't the case, right? Or like maybe these are like religious scientists, and they're trying to inculcate moral virtue in the brain. Okay, well then you should have experiences that are geared towards maximizing your virtue. Is that okay? So like I assume for most people, their experiences don't look like they're geared towards any particular purpose. And so like yeah, so like how do you explain the scientist motivation? You just have some bizarre motivation, like they're trying to make it look like they're not programming it, or like they're not pursuing any purpose, right?
Now, related to this, those are some good points, and I think they'll carry over to what I'm about to ask you. Um, an interesting skeptical scenario is actually affirmed or at least entertained by Elon Musk. So he says something to the effect of this: given the rapid technological progress of the last 50 years, from the game Pong to, I mean, efficient artificial intelligence, in 1,000 years, we will very likely have created simulations so realistic that even the people within the simulations think it's all real. But then who's to say that hasn't already happened? We could easily be in a futuristic simulation, almost like Matrix style, and think incorrectly that our world is real. Or that's what Elon Musk says anyway. So
Yeah.
you're an epistemologist, you study knowledge, and we've just been talking about skeptical scenarios and such as the brain in a vat hypothesis. And I think they're very similar because they involve scientists kind of creating
Yeah,
this
yeah,
virtual world. So how would you respond to that?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that by the way comes from Nick Bostrom, the philosopher. And so Bostrom says, well, like at some time in the future, computing power will be so cheap that the overwhelming majority of beings to have ever lived will be simulated. They'll be computer simulated beings, not flesh and blood beings. Okay, and so then you're supposed to think, oh, so then I'm probably a simulated being. Okay, but Bostrom only says that he thinks there's like a 20% chance that we're living in a simulation, right? And which I think is much too high. And then, but then Elon Musk comes and says, "Oh no, there's like the odds are billions to one in favor of our being in a simulation," which just sounds completely insane. Like the sort of thing that a schizophrenic would think. But he's not schizophrenic. Anyway, and also, I'm not sure that the people who say this in fact believe it. I think that they believe it, but they don't, because try writing to Elon Musk, or, well, he won't respond to you, but try writing to Nick Bostrom and telling him that you've seen some glitches in the matrix, right? And then like to, try to describe something that happened to you in your life that could be explained by a glitch in the matrix. And what do you think he's going to say? You think he's going to say, "Oh, wow, that's good evidence that we're in a simulation"? No, he's going to say, "Go talk to a psychiatrist." Right? Because, the people who give this argument never actually think that they've seen a glitch in the matrix, right? But okay. But anyway, yeah. So the simulation hypothesis is like the brain in a vat scenario. It's also unfalsifiable, but it also has like additional assumptions that the brain in a vat scenario doesn't have. So it has the assumption that computer simulations can think, right? Like that is, if you
Right.
have a computer simulated person, then that there is actually a consciousness that experiences the things that the computer simulated person is supposed to experience, right? Um, and I have near zero credence in that. Okay, but so so the simulation hypothesis is like the brain vat scenario, but worse because it also requires controversial philosophical assumptions about consciousness.